Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 191. Before we get started, a quick reminder to follow IOH on LinkedIn or YouTube. Our topic today is Agentic AI, pushing the gaps in existing protocols. Our guest today is George Fletcher, Identirati at Large, formerly a guest on episode 108 on delegated authorization, and Carl McGinnis, Identirati at Large, formerly a guest on episode 66, which you might remember was on NHI with Ryan Bradley, and episode 99 on OpenID provider commands. So welcome, guys.
Hey, glad to be here.
Thanks, Mike, for inviting me.
So we are going to dive right into it because you already did your intros. Most people in the industry probably know who you are already. If they don't, you can go back to episode 108 for George and episode 66 for Carl. And just a quick note that each episode has a geeky wiki page where I put up the homework, the description, my takeaways, a link to the short. It's always glue.co/IOH- the episode number. So we're going to dive right into the topic today. There's no way we'll have enough time to cover all the questions I prepared, but we're going to start with a question for George. At the heart of this challenge for software identity, we've been facing this for a long time. In SAML, we had static manual service providers or SPs. In OAuth, we introduced more dynamic RPs, relying parties who could register and get credentials. Spiffy provides a great way to bootstrap workload identity, but even maybe Spiffy has too much friction. And I'm wondering if Agentic is taking this software identity concept to 11 and just totally breaking the assumptions on which we used to generate software identity.
So probably the first thing here is that what do we exactly mean by software identity? Generally, I think of a key element being an identifier, a unique identifier, and some representation for what that software does. Even if that's a reasoning LLM, it still has some sort of intention or who wrote it or metadata or whatever. So I think for me, where this gets more complicated is, agents spawning sub-agents, and that can happen very quickly, and those sub-agents can be created for a very specific task. And so in that context, does each of those sub-agents need to reach out to the Spiffy server to get, an identity that it can use to authenticate itself? Or are there ways potentially from we're talking about gaps in standards. Are there ways where the spawning agent can effectively birthright provision keys or mechanisms into the sub-agent, along probably also with some authorization constraints? And I think we've got more questions talking about that side of things, which would give a little bit more ability for these things to operate independently, as opposed to having to go back to the central server every time. At the same time, there's an interesting auditability question, right? If these things are just running on their own, and how is that data tracked? So yes, I think it's pushing those boundaries. If potentially with the right sort of spiffy deployment, you might be able to handle the load and do it for each of your workloads. I think that's going to be somewhat deployment specific.
Carl, you want to bounce off on that at all?
Yeah.
We can move to the next topic, but you might have some thoughts on
It's a good opening topic. And it has just a lot to do with just, how we've modeled historically NHI and versus human identities. What are the properties? What's Delta? And I think, George was hitting on sort of the open world nature of sort of agentic outcomes, where it's going to, depending on what it's trying to do, it may determine, it needs to create a bunch of sub-agents, give them dynamic ephemeral identities. How do you chain that trust back to something central? How do you flow it? And then you deal with the idea that, a lot of the OAuth stuff is built around a dedicated authorization server endpoint that is hosted on a secure endpoint. Now you're moving that onto the device or onto the agent harness or onto the orchestration engines, which just puts a lot of stress on sort of the design of a lot of the protocols we're using today, which is why you see a lot of folks sort of greenfielding, hey, if I have just keys and I have HTTP headers and I have just stuff native to the HTTP stack, how can I, operate closer to sort of how the orchestration engines are operating inside of the harnesses versus sort of more of this dedicated, hey, I have to go through a trust boundary, you have to go through a hop that has a performance hit, or how do I track all the ephemeral identities that don't really necessarily have lifetime outside of the task. So we're dancing around that, workload identity solved a good problem statement for a more fixed closed world problem where I could pre-enumerate the permissions. I could give it an identity at runtime, and it solved the runtime credential issuance problem for a more fixed workload. But as George was articulating well, sort of the open world problems of where agents start opening up that surface area, it definitely is a new area. And that's, I think right now you're seeing lots of folks experimenting with different approaches, and it has a lot to just do with how the harnesses and the agents or agent frameworks are developing at scale, and just running into some of those problems where you can't just use a traditional authorization server for.
Yeah, I want to stay on this topic for a second. So in OAuth, we have dynamic client registration. Mm-hmm. And we've seen a proposed draft. I don't know if it went forward, but the draft was something like attestation-based client registration, mm-hmm. where the client could assert, let's say, a public key, so it could do asymmetric authentication. And then even further, we've seen there's a very popular new draft in the MCP community is client identity metadata document, mm-hmm. Which is popularly pronounced SIMD now, not CIMD, SIMD.
Yep.
But that's also like an attestation-based like authentication. And we've seen this also in the wallet ecosystem. When presenting a verifiable credential from a wallet, maybe the dynamic client registration of the software wallet is like too much. It's not going to happen. So the wallet's just going to say sort of, here's my information. So, but a lot of these client identities are hopefully helping us move to secure or to asymmetric secrets for software authentication. And one would hope that there's some type of secure enclave where a private key could be securely stored. And so does the agent identity then sort of become, in practice, maybe the ability to assert control of a private key? It almost sounds like I'm talking about blockchain, doesn't it? George, maybe you could I guess the question is, what is the state of existing standards, with regard to, asymmetric authentication? Like what are our capabilities today in that area? And maybe how does that might that evolve? And is that really the key to this agent identity problem?
Well, again, agent identity, we need a good definition for it, right? So there's an identifier, there's some sort of mechanism needed for client authentication, around that identifier, and then you need some level of trust. And I'm going to put it in quotes because we can't define trust.
Can I just pause there for 1 second, though? It's a really interesting point you bring up. Claudry Hepburn actually uses a SPIFFE-like protocol, and the identifier is made up by Claudry Hepburn. So it makes up all these like human readable names. But in blockchain world, the identifier is basically your public key. So do we really need an identifier? If isn't your public key, couldn't it also be an identifier?
So I would argue that I don't believe in blockchain that your identifier is your public key, at least not in a lot of the identity mechanisms, right?
That's true. You have an address. a
You want
blockchain.
to be able to rotate your key, so it's not
Right.
Okay.
it's not your
Yeah.
key. It's
So
your
so
data.
here's the fundamental capability that we're finding in what I'm going to call these wide ecosystem environments is that you need a resolvable identifier, an identifier that you can resolve to metadata, right? And when you do that, right, and you resolve the metadata, then in the metadata can be the public key. Now you can use a DID and a blockchain or a DID without a blockchain, right? And resolve that identifier to metadata, right? A DID object is metadata, right? SIMD is here's an identifier. I'm going to resolve it to metadata. In that case, my metadata, is a JSON, a JSON object, with its defined schema. The client attestation is fundamentally the client talks to its own backend and says, please give me an attestation that I'm a good client, and bind it to my private key and my secure enclave. And then I will present that package to the service, right? Which is similar kind of resolve to metadata. So I think that fundamentally is what we're finding we need. The issue is that in that metadata, right, I need how do I authenticate this thing, right? So that it can effectively do client authentication into my service where I'm receiving the request. And I need metadata that tells me how much should I trust it, right? Like how much capabilities internally should it have, right? When it shows up, and that trust piece is like completely. There's all sorts of ideas and mechanisms, and there's a lot of people going after reputation systems. There's a lot of people. You could potentially, in certain circumstances, people have deployed OpenID Federation to deal with this, though that's a little bit more of a static, as we talked about earlier, a little bit more of a static kind of federation. The raw dynamic kinds of this thing shows up and should I let it talk to me? I think there's, to Carl's point, right? People are just trying everything right now to try and figure out what works and what doesn't, right? So we're what's the old metaphor or adage? You throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, or something.
Yeah,
Mud at the walls.
Yeah.
Something like that.
One area that I've trying to explore is in this specific area. You mentioned the client attestation piece. One area that I hit pretty early was just that same realization that client registration, even if you use SIMD, represents more of a class of software type problem statement, where you already have, before agentic outcomes, you have this problem today on the SaaS-based products, right? You have multiple different native and web apps. You have multiple different components. You could even have a suite of applications all representing a single client ID. So a client ID is really an aggregate of software that's really just saying, I consent for this client record, which could be a suite of software. And so it's not any distinctive before agentic. And then you throw agentic on top of it, where now you have ephemeral instances that could be spun up that are acting as that client. And client attestation piece was, came out of the wallet initiatives and the need to prove sort of the device attestation properties, that it's this wallet on this particular device. So it started to push on this instance level concept, but it only brought it to client authentication. It didn't go as far yet to say, how does it get represented across all the other OAuth interactions, this instance? And so that's the open question that I have some posts about to explore, is how do we want to move forward with instance level identity that is different than client identity? One proposal that I've kind of just started flushing out is really trying to model client instances as actors, not as net new clients. And I'm just double dipping in sort of work around modeling actor claims inside of tokens. And that kind of is one approach to deal with the ephemeral nature of, hey, you have this instance of software being spun up acting in a particular task or in a particular context. It can be preserved as an actor chain across a set of token delegations. So that goes back to your subagent granting a subagent, granting a subagent. That could then flow through token exchanges or other mechanisms, and how that gets represented. And it wouldn't necessarily require flowing a client instance identifier as a net new top level concept inside of OAuth. It's really kind of extending on actor modeling, and it may or may not be the right solution, but it's definitely one way to think about it. And so definitely looking for feedback on that, because it hits onto some of those pieces that are here. It doesn't solve all of it, but it's trying to chain that down from an instance perspective, which is from SIMD, you can publish, here's my issuer. It's kind of an issuer IDP model, right? So, hey, I publish an issuer of instances, back to chaining trust, as George mentioned, that becomes a trust root. Then that could be an agent platform, could be an agent harness. It could be, an implementation of an agent platform of how it's going to spin up agents is that trust root. And then you can then chain that through a series of identifiers in actor chains. It's curious how folks will respond to it, but it's definitely some ideas.
We're 25% through the live stream, and we haven't even finished up on question one.
All right, so sorry, move on to the next one.
Par for the course, but so I'm going to pivot a little bit to an area where I'm going to keep Carl. I'm going to keep you in the hot seat for a second, and pivot into one of the areas where you've been doing some interesting work. The idea that there's a protocol gap in the area of conveying an agentic mission. And why is this such an important gap in our toolkit? And how would that mission be expressed as a value? And how can even a well-shaped mission still fail once an agent is operating in the real world?
Yeah, so this kind of came about when I was starting to look at what traditional identity infrastructure organizations have deployed, or how do they address the rise of agents, and where would you model some of these challenges? And so I was just looking at, identity versus access versus delegation versus authority. So identity obviously is the one that we in access are terms that we probably are very familiar with who is acting, may this request proceed. It's really a request time concept. Delegation is, a lot of folks may point to OAuth that, hey, we have delegation today. Can this actor do on behalf of another, is sort of modeling sort of delegation. This last piece was the part that really was like I got stuck at, which is we didn't really have a great way to answer today, which is, may this actor continue to act, and how? So it's a continuity of action, and when does that authority get established? How does it get governed over its lifetime? How can it be revoked independently of tokens, independently of a set of boundaries? So you may start on one set of tokens that may be issued. You may hop across boundaries, and authority may get changed or revoked, which comes back to sort of the open world nature of agents, which is when I give it a broad-based intent to go solve a problem, it may discover things on that path and need to potentially get governed and changed, which is, do I want to broaden the list of things that it can talk to based on the things that it previously found? How should I broaden it? How do I constrain, as we just mentioned, a lot of these sub-agents and tasks? So that's an authority governance layer that just wasn't existing today. And I just was looking at different terms, which is intent was really more modeling just sort of the expression of what a human wanted to do. It didn't really address the governable aspects of a life cycle of constraints, purpose, binding. So mission was a way to bind all that across a set of hops, use cases, and continuity. So in my modeling, at least, you shape a mission, you approve a mission, it becomes a governable aspect, and then the tokens refer back to the mission. And can get into some interesting challenges of how much do you serialize or mandate formats that prescribe the constraints of the mission that's been approved by the human or approved by the organization. How does that flow across the gaps? Is it more of an introspection, distributed system challenges of semantic meanings? How do we want to serialize it? Different folks are representing this in protocols in different ways to try to flow some of this. But it's really just trying to get into continuity of authority across a series of execution and tokens, and using that to determine should the agent continue to still act, even though authority may have changed since the initial task was originally created. So that's sort of where mission kind of sits. And so to me, it sits a layer above what we traditionally think of as identity infrastructure today. And so it's a new governable top-level object that you're going to create that has long-term auditability and understanding, which is this agent still acting according to the mission? I have evidence to evaluate that and determine, should I continue it? Should I strengthen it? Should I loosen it? Should I revoke it? And it's going to have dependencies on a bunch of protocols and things to get there. And OAuth has a bunch of challenges. There's net new protocols that are trying to look at some of that stuff. And so it's a broad concept that's going to take a while, I think, for the industry to figure out where that fits. But I have a pretty strong belief, at least, that that's a layer that we're going to need as part of our IAM vocabulary going forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I think another really important aspect of it is when we think about provisioned entitlements, right? The way like what a piece of software can do is not likely to change, right? So like if to use some simple travel example, if the piece of software is allowed to book hotels for me, right? The entitlement is book hotels, right? The mission that Carl's talking about is book a room in Knoxville on April 23rd, right? And then I can put other constraints around that, but that then becomes this additional, sort of like layer or plane in which authorization is constrained, right? And in conversations with Carl and other people that have happened, like at IAW, right? I think that when we gave entitlements to humans, right, we for the most part expect humans to apply common sense and do things and apply their entitlement at the right time. And sure, there's the rogue, sleeper agent and the whatever, but generally the risk of software doing, of the human, of all my employees doing wacky things, is really small, right? Not so true for running software that is reasoning. And so this becomes a really critical factor in how we manage authorization going forward. So like how we get there, I agree with Carl. It's not like super transparent or super visible. Dick Hart in his AOF work has tried to pull in some of this. But we need to get there because it becomes a critical factor in the overall authorization policy that needs to be evaluated when a particular task is being requested.
Just to make it crisp, it's like we understand enough of the problems of one resource server talking to one authorization server as its authorization server with a client that knows that authorization server. There's already enough challenges with like scopes and FGA and RAR and problems in that domain. Now imagine you times that by n number of authorization servers and resource servers that I've never knew existed before. Again, the open world problem. And each RAR is token bound to that individual relationship. It's another RAR request at a particular access token that's bound to that access token. There's nothing unifying the hundreds of RARs that need to get issued for the mission. And how do all the other downstream authorization servers get influenced by what I as a human or my governance authority has approved for those downstream calls if we're solving this in a point-to-point authorization server RAR kind of world. And that's sort of like the why you have to think of these things as just a dramatically different scale of sort of the types of relationships that we've been modeling before.
I just want to hang on this point for a second. Carl, how would we actually express the mission? Would it be natural language?
Yeah, so that's the intent part. And then at some point, it gets into how much of this is represented at the protocol and how much of this is implementation. And so this is sort of where the rubber meets the road and how we evolve out, right? So the more opaque at the protocol level, where it's a hash of the signature, it's an opaque reference, the less implementation details we need to agree on across it. And there could be ways to dereference that, again, similar to like introspection or other token formats that could potentially serialize it. But to make it actionable at runtime, you need to compile it into something that's runtime enforceable at some level. And that's where your policy languages and other things can be useful in doing that. But that's a semantic problem. So now you're getting into mapping the intent into a semantic layer and determining what resources, how it should work. And that gets into you're trusting the LLMs at some point to help with that layer. And those can also be tainted or context tainted based on what it discovers. And so you're trying to figure out how much can I solve at the shaping level and how much do I need to solve at the containment level, which gets into a lot of the tools that we've been employing over the last years, which is reducing the scope of tokens, making them short-lived, making revocation happen, making risk a first-class citizen so you can start modeling risk-based behaviors and being able to respond to risk in real time. And a lot of these types of things that we've been implementing now just happen at a dramatically different scale in order to help with some of the containment pieces, because you're not going to fully be able to model and de-risk it at the approval level. You're going to have runtime issues that you're going to need to contain blast radius around.
Yeah, I wanted to pivot into a related question, George. So let's say we had this like well shaped artifact that told us about the mission with various claims, intent, mandate, whatever. And let's say we had perfect tokens and perfect trust models. It seems like it's still challenging for us on the authorization side. Like how do like how do we make to what extent are we facing an authorization challenge? Not really an identity challenge. Even if we had the perfect tokens, do we have the authorization capabilities today to really solve security that we want to solve?
So no, I don't think we have those. We have bits and pieces, right? Things like, externalizing your policy could be useful, a la Authzen, right? If uh, as- assuming that you said I have perfect, mission structuring and association of policy and whatever, and I've got, the right kinds of, you know, tokens, and I can reach back into my, the agent 5 layers down can somehow reach back to my identity wallet to get a credential to access my loyalty, my loyalty account at that hotel that it's trying to book, right? And all of that stuff. You may have enough information that you could, pass it off to an Authzen or some sort of PDP-ish thing, that's tailored for that particular workload, and run policy and say, yes, you can, or it's almost enough, but not quite. And we need to ask the user, which is a whole different, sort of issue around consent and how do we manage that. But sort of ignoring that rabbit trail for a minute, there's all these gaps that are present, right? I don't think that, Authzen by itself is sufficient because it needs all the context that Carl was talking about. And there probably, I think there may be in certain use cases, another layer of context, an even higher layer of context. So if you apply this in, let's say, medical or legal scenarios or we'll just, a healthcare power of attorney, right? That's an explicit relationship between, one person to another person, maybe even to a group of people, right? And here's this healthcare power of attorney, and that's the most, that's sort of like the largest bound around what can be authorized, right? So if somehow the LLM said, hey, I want to open a bank account on behalf of this user, right? It fails because it's not allowed by the healthcare power of attorney, but then the particular task that's in hand, the mission that it's handling right now, constrains it more, right? And then you have that sort of underlying plane of what are the entitlements that are given to the bits of software. And all of that somehow needs to be represented, right, in a way that some policy engine or, really cool graph or, other mechanism can evaluate it and say, yes, this is sort of within the scope, overloading that term intentionally, of this particular mission. And so we will go ahead and do it. Or it's not, and I need to, somehow engage the user or the originating LLM to say, nope, sorry, can't do that, right? Like work with the user to figure, to tweak the mission so that we can do it again. And I would say the mechanisms we have for doing that process, it's easy for me to talk about. We don't have any of the mechanisms for doing it, right? In the sense of protocols. There's building blocks laying around, right? So they're not perfect Legos, but there's sort of Lego-ish. But the whole holistic picture, I think, is not well defined. And what I see is that people have a particular use case that they're trying to solve and deploy right now. And so they do something that solves that. And then they say, hey, it works. Right? Let's make it a standard. And that's kind of where we're at right now. So yes, authorization is still a big problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment about authzen. So in my opinion, authzen tells you how to make the request. Can this principal do this action on this resource with this context? And that's good, because at least we don't have 10 different PDP vendors defining 10 different ways to send a request. But it doesn't tell you how to actually express the policies. And that's actually the hard part. And whether you use a graph to evaluate that answer, um, or um, or some other mechanism, let's say Cedar or whatever, you return the response. But the hard part is actually the interoperability part comes from not just the how you made a request, but how I know that when I send you this token with this expression of mission through these claims, that I can expect this type of behavior from this issuer that I trust. And so
that's what I was mentioning, is how much coupling
yeah.
you want in these stacks, or you make trade-offs, right? And so we can define everything must be Cedar, everything has to be serialized, everything has to be in this particular way, but then you completely constrain the deployment space of who can adopt it and what vendors can play for it. You could start with, let's just define the narrowest interface possible, but then you leave all these context graph evaluation, modeling problem statements left to deployment, and then you don't lose it. You don't have interoperability. In a fast-moving environment where we are now, it's like we don't want to over-constrain, because 6 months from now, the agent harnesses could look completely different, right? And we're learning as we go, which is why we're just trying to tease out right now, what are some of the layers that we know are going to be more long-lived? How do we start putting definition around and layering that, right? And then where in the stack can we evolve out, and where do we want bets on net new protocol stacks to experiment and learn from? We're going to have to push and pull across those two, because I'll tell you, OAuth stuff is going to take a lot of work to get it where we need to. Not saying it's not worthy work, but we have an adoption challenge there, which is how you're going to get 7 vendors to adopt 17 extensions all in the right order to get to the right outcome, right? And so we're at this point where it's just moving so quick that we have to be aware that, and I think part of what George is articulating is we have to kind of start building that shared mental model of where we're going, start teasing out the layers, what layers are more stable, which layers need more experimentation, and start thinking through the stack instead of just an individual, how do I thread a single threaded use case across everything?
Right. Well, George also said that, he sort of questioningly said, I guess you need central policy management. And I didn't really think that's up for debate. So how do you think enterprises are going to have to change today, Carl? Because you've been in the steeped in the enterprise space.
Well, I think enterprises like
current approach to
single domain
going to work.
I think enterprises know single domain, right? They like this idea of my ring of trust with my policies and things I know about. And when you start breaking that down and enabling this to be cross-organization, like it starts to cause friction for how organizations like to think in quantity and manage risk, right? We have supply chain risk today, right? From a consulting tech support organization, and the risks of their processes and procedures for how they secure their identity core infrastructure and laptops and users start interacting with my resources. You can have significant security issues from that problem statement. Now expand that out across the entire agent supply chain, and then you deal with implementation and adoption, where maturity, the partner, this use case that you want to work with doesn't have the right part of their stack for you to interoperate with, for you to get your use case going, and then incentive structures to be able to modernize it, and economic models to be able to fund it. So I think those are like where the enterprise is trying to figure out right now, which is just how do I make success for my employees to start adopting and modernizing, because I need to start my company moving around this agentic route, which now I have agents that aren't interactive sessions. What controls do I put in place? And that's where they're looking at initial sets of use cases and vendors and stacks of just trying to say maybe my corporate IDP, the way it exists today, isn't right size for the right set of use cases, or maybe I need to start thinking about this control plane. And it's, to me, not that dissimilar from where the world was when we started thinking about cloud adoption and zero trust adoption and these challenges, where an organization had their stack in a particular, everything's behind my data center, behind my firewall, behind my Cisco PIX router or firewall, and having to start to rethink the infrastructure concerns. And I think that's kind of where we are now, and we're, it's hard to fast forward for it to like everything's Kubernetes and a multi-cloud deployment of workload identity in a 3-month period, right? And that's kind of where we are.
I haven't heard PIX firewall in a long time.
I was thinking way back to something. That's the first word of like early pain point memory of dealing with the firewall.
George, any reaction to that and thoughts about the enterprise sort of adapting to this challenge?
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with Carl, and I think you're going to end up with, like, businesses need to deploy and they need to make things work, right? So, some of it is, can I articulate the risk? But some of it is just going to be, right, the risk of doing nothing is larger than the risk that may occur in, deploying something that might not be as secure as I would like, right? So the CISOs are going to get a lot less sleep. What sort of struck, Carl, as you were talking, is that one of the areas that I think we will get sort of ad hoc kinds of mechanisms, though potentially not in a bad way, is crossing these trust boundaries. To your point, Mike, right, the policy that you have within one trust boundary, right, is based off of, certain kinds of attributes and attribute values and all these other kinds of things. And when you go into that other trust domain, they probably have different names, different values, all of these kinds of things. So to get the same behavior that you want, or to attenuate your behavior, which seems to be the big word we're using these days, to continue scoping down what's allowed as you make the next downstream hop, is when you cross that trust domain boundary, something's going to have to be smart enough to know about that other trust domain and do the translation. So I do think the identity chaining draft we have has the base framework that can be used at least right now, and we can build on top of it and effectively let the AS act as that smart node that knows about the other trust domain and can do the transformations that are necessary in order to get something, at least keep us sort of in line with what should be happening. And so I think that there are some building blocks like that we can leverage to enable people to do things now, even if it is sort of ad hoc and company to company. And then those networks can grow. But from a standards perspective and pushing on gaps in standards, right? Standards can't solve this problem, right? There's just no way that we can build them fast enough to completely solve the problem. So to Carl's point, we need to get the right mental model. I think from a standards perspective, we should be focusing on, do we have the right mental model? Do we have the right layering, right? And start building that kind of thinking, helping distribute that kind of thinking. And then as experiments happen and stuff goes, right, because it's just going to go, then we begin to pull it, we begin to pull that in maybe to something that in the future is a standard. But the dynamics, the business dynamics right now are such that, the standards aren't going to help in the sense of, here's the solution to the problem. It's just too big. And I don't know that well, I will just say it this way. I know I do not have my head around all of the problems, all of the use cases. I mean, the space is enormous to try and say this is exactly the right mental model.
Carl, I actually want to get one question in because we're coming up on the end.
Okay.
So I'm just going to pivot a little bit to, I'm curious if you have any predictions about which standards that are out there today will raise in prominence in the next couple of years, or conversely, if there are any standards which you think will maybe fall out of use or become not as important.
Well, some lessons learned from I kind of just go back to like open web, right? And just sort of like what are problems we solved on open web, and where are some of that alignment, and where does that kind of start crossing over here? So like one that I particularly am watching for and see some use cases is just with certificate issuance, we had a big issue around automating that, right? So we built the Acme protocol layer to automate life cycles, and we built certificate transparency as a mechanism to audit the issuance in a decentralized kind of fashion in a append-only log. So we can get to a point where we get really smart tokens and start trying to solve things at a very, very smart token level, or at some level, we can also just embrace the fact that you only need to prove this in an audit mechanism, and so we can do this in a transparency log mechanism. So revocation is going to be a challenge in all these models due to the distributed nature, the boundaries, the scale of these problem statements. And so we're going to have, the same pendulum of like, is it OSCP or is it CRLs? And like this pendulum swing that we saw on open web and kind of fail open, fail close, and like just shorten the lifetimes, do cert transparency, and like get the ROI, and don't try to be too clever on the revocations, right? Maybe that's kind of, I'm just learning from, that's how it worked on the public web with lots of parties. And so I'm leaning into that and indexing into that as like a proof point of like, maybe that's where some value is for us to align behind. Because it's going to be hard for me to see like how a super complex CAPE architecture for revocations I don't know, maybe it will work in some deployment models, but like, again, open web problem statement. So just thousands of agents, millions of agents all interacting across different resource servers, authorization servers with tokens and issuances. So that's one that I'm paying attention to. I think AAuth is interesting. I don't know if it'll survive or not, but I know what will survive is the experimentation. What's going to survive is we have a clean room to understand the actors and the roles. We can figure out the noise and get it working in live deployments. And then once we get to a state where live production, broad sets of scenarios, we can then make an honest bet of saying how much is worth changing OAuth or retrofitting bridges, gateways, components in the stack to interface or not. I think that's going to be a 12 to 18 to 24 month journey. I would hope that in 24 months we get some signal there of what's been sticking. Just to the rates of how things are changing so fast. Outside of that, tokens, formats, all these things are going to come and go. It's hard for me to pick a winner right now at there. It's just everyone can invent their own crypto to sign a chain of things and exchange things and do things. Interoperability and customer value and adoption challenges are going to kind of figure out what sticks. I mean, JWT stuck. Was unclear if that was going to happen or not when that standard came about, and it ended up winning developer mindsets. Similar here, like developers. Like what's going to be dead simple for developers? And not only that, now increasingly because it's all coding agents, what are the coding agents going to self-select as their stack, right? And so the whole developer agent experience layer of just like making this stuff like interesting tangent is like why every spec we write now doesn't have a corresponding sort of agent file for it to consume the spec, right? Why are we only now writing specs for humans to read the IETF specs? Like we should be making it easy for the agents to build reference implementations on the fly and start interacting. Like that whole problem is also that people are going to like focus on this agent experience layer, and maybe their boutique solution is going to end up getting adoption just because they got the right level of agent experience layer in this stuff. So just kind of realizing just lessons we've learned from the last era is kind of picking and choosing is hard, but I'm just kind of pick on sort of these broader themes. I think those are some areas that are top of mind right now. I don't know, George, do you have something?
And George, I wanted to ask to create a particular pivot on this, but I would love to hear your predictions about the underappreciated standard that maybe is going to become more important, or the overappreciated or overused standard that might drop. But I also wanted to sort of add in to that as a fellow UMA-tarian. We know UMA is not going to get adoption at this point, but I think UMA did get some things right. Or maybe if you could also comment on some of the things that UMA got right.
Sure. So I think one of the really interesting things is that UMA focused a lot on what some might call delegated access, right? The sort of sharing aspect. It's not the only way to use UMA, but a lot of the examples and a lot of the things, comparisons made with like Google Doc sharing and whatever were really around this kind of piece of Alice defines policy for her resource, and then Bob can access that resource within the context of that policy. That potentially could change the resource, But I don't think we talked about it as much in the context of the other examples we've given today, in the office hours. So, but that basically sort of centralizing the policy and allowing actually for constraints. So one of the, there's a little bit of the mission and intent in UMA, because you could basically say, you can access my vacation photos, but only if you agree that you will not download them, print them, or sell them, right? And so you could put those kinds of constraints around the intent of the share, and then, or Bob can, schedule a meeting with me, right? But only in, free time, right? Not in busy time. Or if I have multiple layers, not in the super important he can't schedule over a super important meeting, but he can schedule over a common meeting. And, so that all of those kinds of mechanisms were enabled with UMA. And I think that was good. The resource registration kinds of things, we're seeing that come out in other places now, where somebody's saying like, hey, I have, I'm going to register my resource and say, this is what it can do. Was a key part of UMA, right? The resource server would tell the UMA authorization server, here's the resource and here's the associated scopes with it and some other things, right? And then the resource owner would go into the authorization server and say, okay, for that particular resource, here's all the policy, right? And, you could think about that as like, hey, I'm gonna pull in my my social media groups, and then I'm going to share with that. So
I think that's also the challenge, is that wasn't probably from a business model or so separate realm, but from a scale perspective, like the semantic problem and ontological problems of bring your authorization model of your resource server to a shared layer is still, I think, a big gap.
Right.
Yeah, we'll go to last thoughts in a minute. I just had one quick comment about UMA. Well, in AOTH, it's a resource server first flow. And in UMA was one of the first probably resource server first flows. So I thought that was interesting. I like how UMA, in that flow, in AOTH, you get back a token. But in UMA, you got back a reference ID. I actually think the reference ID is more privacy protecting, because the token maybe leaks. If this is an unknown requester, giving them the token might have more information than you want to receive, you want to actually share. So yeah, I don't know. I think in some ways UMA flushed out this more complex scenario, and I feel like developers weren't ready for thinking about that. But I feel like agentic transactions that we're looking at are forcing this conversation maybe a little bit more and making it more important, and that we now need, and now it's gotten even more complicated than it was with what we had with web-based resource sharing. And so maybe it doesn't pay to only go to UMA now. We have to go beyond UMA. But it might have been helpful if we'd done UMA in the first place, or done something in the middle. But with that said, let's go to last thoughts. We're way over time. We're at 48 minutes. So Carl, I'll give you last first thoughts, because George proposed the episode, so we'll give him last thoughts. Oops.
Last thoughts. I think this next decade is going to just be us focusing on how to govern what things can do once they're inside all our systems, interacting across all these. It's, to me, the 10-year challenge is us to figure out how to, just like we had to with previous generations of things, self-governance, is that it's going to take us a long time to get there. And so I think that's going to be the conversation that we should expect to see at any conference, in different shapes and forms, and evolving, and lessons learned, and patterns and practices, and keep learning about it as we go as a community. So I anticipate that to be that sort of talk track. Stop talking about zero trust, start talking about how we're going to solve governance now is going to be the area.
Awesome. George, last thoughts?
Sure. I think one of the challenges for us is going to, us as a community, is going to be balancing the I need to deploy this tomorrow, right? And I need to update and work with other people to make sure that we have the mental model correct. Carl talked about the mental model. And we need to be able to do those things in parallel. If we get too focused on the tactical, it's going to cause all sorts of problems in the future. And obviously, we can't just focus on the strategic. So figuring out the way to balance that and the environments and the communities in which to have those conversations, I think is something that we need to sort of focus in on now, so that as we do these things in parallel over the next decade, right, we're working together.
So with those, you mentioned spaces. With those spaces, one of them might be EIC next week, which George is going to. So sort of jealous, but I'll be going to sunny Minneapolis, which is way better than Berlin, for the Open SSF Community Day meeting. But if anyone's there, have fun and enjoy. Cooper always does an amazing job. I'm sure it'll be super fun. While you're at actually, the next episode, which I guess is Thursday, is Andres Aguiar, who's one of the leads of the OpenFGA project. We're going to talk more about agents. This is based on a talk he gave at the MCP Dev Summit on intent-based authorization and AI agents. It's a great talk. I already heard it. So we're going to do sort of a representation of that, that content. And with that, just logistically, I'll remind you, please follow IOH on LinkedIn and YouTube. With that, I will say thank you, George. Thank you, Carl. And we'll see you next time.